Hi, I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. Before we start, a warning that today's episode deals with sexual assault and residential school survivors.
This was a terrible place, though. That place down there on the end, there was really lots of sexual assaults happened on that end.
Down like in the basement?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Under the stairwell.
Huh. So what is it? How do you feel right now watching
I
this
said it's
go
happy in a way and sad in another. Happy it's down and gone, and sad it took so long.
That's Melvin Tibbett speaking to the Globe's Patrick White. They're standing in front of a burning building in northern BC, a building that used to be the Lower Post Residential School.
When you drove by here, I assume every day, did you think about what happened here?
Every day you think of it.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That must be awful.
And then, they had the post office here. They had the band office here. So every day you think about it.
The community gathered to watch the school burn down in a ceremony on September 30th, Canada's first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation.
So I know this is some people just laugh at me for how broad the question is, but what is, it's National Reconciliation Day. What does that mean to you?
Let me tell you what reconciliation means to me.
I would love to know.
To me, reconciliation is saying, well, it happened to me, so I'm okay with it. Well, I'm not okay with it,
Yeah. Nor should you be.
That's what reconciliation means to me. My personal opinion is, it did happen, I'm okay with it. I feel bad about it, but I do. I'm okay, but I don't feel that way,
Yeah. Yes. How do you feel?
I feel. My personal feeling is how could one human being do that to the other human?
Today, Globe reporter Patrick White talks about Lower Post Residential School and a trial in the 1950s that almost held a predator to account for the sexual abuse of students. This is The Decibel. Patrick, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me.
Tell us about Melvin Tibbett. Who is he?
Melvin is an elder in the Lower Post First Nation, which is a Kaska Dena community. The Kaska Dena are Athabascan-speaking people in the northwestern part of the country. He grew up as a young kid on a trap line, and then at age 6 or so, he was forced to go to Lower Post Residential School. His first week there, he told me he thought it was heaven. He, for the first time in his life, smelled oranges, but it eventually dawned on him after a few days that the oranges were not for the kids, and the treatment they endured was horrible. He himself endured physical and sexual abuse at the school. And once he left the school around age 17, he ended up on Skid Row in Vancouver, addicted to drugs and alcohol. And it was only in the 1980s and 1990s that he, as he said to me, started working on himself. And he managed to turn things around and move back to Lower Post.
Tell us about this residential school. Where was it and when was it open?
Well, so this residential school is just along the BC-Yukon border, about 4 hours from Whitehorse. And it operated from its opening in 1951 till 1975. And at its peak, it had hundreds of students going there. I think it was over 20 different communities that fed this school. So it was quite a vast swath of northern BC and also most of the Yukon as well that fed into this school. So on the first day of school, it'd be a huge mix of languages and cultures that were all being mashed together in this one school.
Why did this community decide to burn down the old residential school that was there?
The nation lacking a lot of administrative buildings and larger buildings, turned it into an administration building. The post office occupied it, and a few other local offices were stationed there for about another 45 years. And for a lot of people in that community who attended the school, this was a constant reminder of what they went through. So the young chief they have now, Harlan Schilling, is 34 years old. A number of other chiefs had tried before to get it demolished, and he managed to get it through in the last couple of years. He convinced the federal government to allow him. And I told Harlan, I would really like to be there for that, to be among community members when that happens. About 24 hours before they were set to light it up, he sent me a text, he being in Whitehorse at the time, I was in Toronto, saying, "We are going to light the school on fire tomorrow. You're welcome to attend." And so within 24 hours, I hopped on a plane to Vancouver and then another plane to Whitehorse and driven the 4 hours southeast along the Alaska Highway to Lower Post to witness this.
What was it like to be there?
There was a real difference. Younger people who had not attended the school, they were filming it on YouTube. They were yelling "good riddance." And so for them, it was just an exciting development in the town. I mean, it's a small town, and this was a massive fire of the central building in town. So it was just something worth watching and celebrating. For some of the older people in town, like Mr. Tibbett, it was a heavy moment.
Patrick, how did you end up telling this particular story about this particular school?
A colleague of mine at the Globe, Tanya Talego, is a national affairs columnist, had been writing extensively about the discovery of unmarked graves in a number of communities across the country. And a 92-year-old former Mountie reached out to her, a guy named Dave Friesen, and said that back in the 1950s, he had served in a community a few kilometers away from Lower Post and had conducted a pretty extensive investigation into sexual assaults at the Lower Post residential school. And Tanya, being the dynamo she is, she didn't quite have time for it, so she passed it along to me. And at first I thought, this is an interesting little historical story that I'd like to look into, so I called Dave Friesen.
So, I mean, if you can take us back then to the time, what was he investigating? What did he find?
So Friesen started looking into a guy named Ben Garen who lived in town, who was often known to ferry around Indigenous boys in his Plymouth station wagon. Friesen also later found out that he had a derisive nickname in town, Backdoor Benny. Then it eventually morphed into an investigation where he interviewed upwards of 30 boys, and he found just devastating stories. He heard stories of Garen's sexual abuse. Eventually charged Garen with 4 counts of indecent assault, and a trial was scheduled for Prince Rupert, quite a ways away, in late 1958.
What was Garen's relationship with this residential school?
Yeah, so that's interesting. He was hired to be the boys' supervisor at the school. In January 1958, Friesen went to the school to confront the principal about Garen. And the principal of the school said, "Yes, we know all about what Ben Garen has been up to with the children, and that's why we let him go." During my reporting, I also found some correspondence from the 1950s between clergy in Whitehorse, which the Lower Post residential school was run out of, Montreal, which was kind of the national head office of the Oblates, which ran the school, and Rome, where church officials acknowledged what was going on at Lower Post residential school. And not only did they acknowledge it, they did not show any sympathy for the real victims. Instead, there were passages saying that this poor brother, in reference to the staff member who was abusing children in that school. And they were trying to devise ways of holding their hand out to this poor brother. And eventually they decided that they would dismiss Garen from Lower Post residential school and give him a new job at another town, but still within the church. But down the road, they would invite him to come back to lower post residential school, despite what they knew he had done.
Wow, that's pretty stomach churning. Where did you find this correspondence, Patrick?
So during the residential school settlement process that the federal government engaged in, researchers with the federal government gathered up a lot of correspondence from church officials, and they turned that correspondence into what they called school narratives. And these school narratives informed how they would settle with different victims. I've read a lot of these narratives from different schools across the country. I'd never read anywhere else except the Lower Post school narrative, where church officials were acknowledging and actively covering up abuse.
You said there was, Friesen was investigating in 57, early 58. He's ready to lay charges. And then you mentioned this trial in Prince Rupert. Can you walk us through what happened at that trial?
Well, it's only starting to become clear what happened to that trial so many years later. The first of the boys was put on the stand, a kid named Leo Miller. And the Crown Counsel began asking him what happened when you were in the cabin with Ben Garen. And Leo Miller recanted everything. He said nothing happened, and that he was in Garen's cabin, but that nothing happened. The Crown Counsel then called up a number of other witnesses, and they all recanted their testimony. So the trial was basically annulled. The charges, Garen was acquitted, and Corporal Friesen, who was sitting in the audience at the time, was completely deflated. He'd spent months and months interviewing dozens of boys, and now his case had come crashing down, and he didn't know why.
Did he ever learn what happened? Why these kids decided to recant?
So he only learned after I told him. So I went to Lower Post this year. Attended the fire that we talked about. One of my goals being up there was to try to find some of those boys who had been called on the stand in Prince Rupert so many years ago. A few had died. I eventually found one guy named Jack Chief who had been up on the stand. And we talked a lot about his residential school experience, how horrible it had been. And then I brought up the trial and what had happened. He said that a few days before they made the trip to Prince Rupert, that he had been visited by a man who told him to, quote, shut it down. He said, don't say a thing or you could be killed. So he'd received a death threat. And he was a kid at the time. He was a young teenager receiving a death threat before trial. And his only guess is that all the witnesses had received the same death threat, and that's why they all recanted.
Do we have any sense of who that was?
Jack knows. He knows who it was, and he said it is a secret he will take to his grave. The only clues he would provide, he said it was somebody associated with Lower Post residential school.
So while this investigation was happening in the 50s, can we look a bit more broadly about what the Rcmp's role was at the time, their role in their relationship with these communities and with residential schools?
Yeah, well, that's relatively easy to do because in 2011, the Rcmp itself delivered a massive report on its role in the residential school system. So any children who ran away from school, it was the job of individual Mounties to go and round up those kids and bring them back. It was also their job to find children to attend school. And a number of people in town told me that in the Lower Post area, it was Mounties who came to their families in the first place and said, you either send your child to Lower Post residential school or you're going to jail. One named for the police, they said used to be common was translated from the Kaska language to English as takers of children. So they had this real enforcement role. And so in this report, this is what got me extremely interested about this story, because reading this report, it just details how the Mounties were involved. It then has a section on how the Mounties investigated wrongdoing at these schools. And there's a passage that says the researchers on this report were unable to find a single example of Mounties investigating physical or sexual assault at a school based on community complaints until about the 1980s, except for one occasion. And the report said there was one investigation starting in 1957 at Lower Post Residential School, where a Mountie in that town charged a former employee of Lower Post Residential School. And reading this, I almost fell off my chair. I remember distinctly reading it and saying, that's Dave Friesen. That's when I got truly excited about the story, because his investigation was truly a one-off.
Okay, so after this period of the investigation and the trial, what happened to the school in Lower Post after the 1950s?
Well, it's pretty sad, because despite school officials, despite the Rcmp, despite church officials knowing exactly what had gone on with Ben Garen at that school, it continued to operate without, it seems, much supervision of the people working there. There was a man named George Mazinski who started working there in the late 50s, and he was an absolute sexual predator. There was rampant sexual abuse at the school during his time there. And again, he was allowed to go from Lower Post and work at other residential schools. This is why another reason I really wanted to investigate this story is because they didn't properly investigate Garen, because his abuses were simply hidden away and excused in a way. I believe that it paved the way for more sexual abuse and more at that school, and for more lives to be ruined.
Okay, so let's talk about the burning of the school again. What will replace the school now?
So the federal government is committed more than $10 million to build a new center that would be band administration. There'd be a sewing room for elders, kind of a multifunctional building. They did so at the urging of Premier John Horgan, who's taken a special interest in Lower Post. That's in the works. The drawings are done. It will not be on the exact site of this building. They still have not decided entirely what's going to go there. As I left, it was just kind of a black hole, and people in the community just hope that they can fill it with something more hopeful. The chief, Harlan Schilling, does have some other ideas, though. He would like to build a cultural revitalization center down the road. And his idea is that it will undo everything that the residential school did to the community.
So, Patrick, we've been talking here about this one residential school where children were abused, but of course this was not the only place where this happened. I guess by talking, though, about this one situation, what can this tell us about the bigger picture of this system of residential schools?
Yeah, I feel we're always talking and writing about the residential school system. I feel that it becomes kind of hazy to talk about it when you talk about it just as a system. But when you drill down to a single school and talk to the people in specific settings trying to battle the system, it becomes much clearer, to me at least, how these institutions affected the individuals who attended them. Often these were very large institutions stationed in very small towns. And I felt another thing about Lower Post is it really showed there were hundreds of students that went to this school. Lower Post itself only has a couple hundred people in it. So you can imagine a school like this operating over a number of years. The amount of trauma that it brings to a town would take years and years to overcome. And I felt that this story really showed this too, how a single school can really thwart the future of a town for a long time.
Yeah, and now
at least some of the public there's a benefit to some of the public at least acknowledging that?
Yep, some do. Most don't. A lot of people will tell me. You know, I went to 2 residential school trauma treatments. I went to 2 because I knew I had to. And the first one I went to, I thought I left a little bit out. I thought I left just a little out. And I came home and I told my wife, Debbie, I said, I left a little bit out. Well, I went back the second time. Well, that little bit was the main part of it, the sexual abuse. And you learn to talk about it. As you talk about it, you feel. And then a lot of people always say, well, why don't you just get over it? Well, I tell them, you know, if you've been through what I've been through, you won't just get over it.
Before we go, an update on another story we've been following about the fuel contamination in Iqaluit's water supply. In October, we spoke to Globe reporter Willow Fiddler.
We're coming close to the end of October now. I've seen reports, that the river in Iqaluit is starting to freeze. Once you get into the winter months, you kind of run into the risk of other complications happening with freezing water and freezing pipes that can cause, further damage to the infrastructure. And the priority, I think, is making sure they get the contaminants out and lifting the boil water advisory, which sounds like may happen by the end of the week.
But it didn't happen by the end of the week. In fact, Iqaluit has now gone nearly 2 months without clean tap water. The military has set up a purification center where people can pick up water, but there's still no timeline for when tap water in the city will be drinkable again. Okay, that's it for today. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms. Timon Johnson is our intern. Our producers are Madeline White and Cheryl Sutherland. David Crosby is our editor. Kyle Fulton mixed this episode. Kasia Mihailovich is our senior producer, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks to Patrick White. You can find more of his work at theglobeandmail.com. You can also email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at MenakaRW. And if you haven't already, please follow The Decibel wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.